Welcome everybody to REBTworks, where we discuss everything related to REBT and beyond. And it's my pleasure to have as a guest an old friend, Dr. Trevor Castor, who I'm going to call a cultural anthropologist. He will correct me if I've gone down the a wrong avenue there. So welcome, Trevor.
Yeah, I think just even that, the whole shift in anthropology has been more towards cognitive anthropology, because they've taken, I guess the field really shifted in the 70s, where there was this sense that there was a cultural determinism going on, and anthropologists were coming in and they were looking at groups of people and saying, what is it that defines this group? What are the boundaries of identity? So they had a lot of identity discourse, but it was always framed in the sense of a collective. And then there was a major shift in the 70s where social constructivism came in, and they said, let's look at really not so much what defines groups, but what defines the process of group making. And so even in that concept of anthropology, it's more towards, the field has gone more towards looking at the process of group making and more towards the individual, rather than seeing the individual just sort of a byproduct of a society, but looking at how that individual both has the influence of society and also how that individual can be an influencer in society. So it's more of a bi-directional process, which, I mean, in some sense, it's the psychologizing, right, of cultural anthropology. So the psychologists have sort of infiltrated all of the fields with this emphasis on the self and identity. So my studies have kind of been, I believe the counselors call it an eclectic approach, right? Whenever you're you don't have any one field that you know well, so you kind of just take a little bit from all the fields. So my research background is in anthropology, theology, and psychology, and specifically looking at narrative identity. And that identity word is kind of the crux of it all.
So it sounds like there's a fragmented self there for you, Trevor. I mean, you've got so it sounds like there's been a shift away from nouns to verbs and looking more at process and formation. Absolutely. Rather than the static entity.
So the debate as to whether or not the self is fixed or fluid, I mean, it goes back to 5th century BCE. There's a playwright. He writes this comedic play, and a person who'd borrowed money from a lender, the lender approaches him and says, you owe me this money and you need to pay it. You're not making your payments and I want the money. And the person who borrowed the money looks at the lender and he says, well, you know that people are constantly undergoing change, and there's this fluidity to my sense of self. And so how can I be held accountable today for something that I borrowed when I was totally a different person, 5 years ago? And so the lender looks at him and he just slaps him right across the face. And the guy who borrows the borrower looks shocked and he says, what, are you offended? Don't be offended. The person who slapped you 30 seconds ago is no longer the person standing in front of you now. And so this is 5th century BCE, where this concept, this debate about whether identity is fixed or fluid, how can someone be held accountable for, it goes into theology. How can someone be held accountable for the sins of their youth when they are older? And are we really, is there any sort of fixed idea that makes a person throughout time, despite all the changes in personality and relationships and actions, behaviors, is there any sense of accountability for a whole person? So this is ancient, this debate is ancient. And the theologians in the early Greeks, they tied it to the soul. And they said, well, the soul is a constant. And I'm sure we could have a whole long discussion about what is a soul, what does that even mean? But they needed something to tie it to. And one of the earliest theologians that really made this connection was Augustine. I always find everything going back to Augustine. The guy was obviously brilliant. I don't agree with some of what he said, maybe a lot of what he said, but he was the first one that really made this idea of an inward turn. And he tied the self and identity to an inward turn, which was really what Enlightenment philosophers did too. And he tied it to consciousness and memory. It's like that thought experiment where you say, how do you know you're the same person when you wake up tomorrow morning than you were when you went to bed last night? Well, and I ask students this all the time, and students always say, well, I remember, I look at myself, I recognize myself. But what Augustine had in there too was he tied it to relationships. And when Augustine, when he's writing his autobiographical account in Confessions, he calls these relationships true friendships. And he says that the true friendships are what give him his sense of being. And so he tied his sense of self not only to his memory and his consciousness, which he would say was placed there by God, but he would say it's also tied to my relationships of significance. My significant relationships are true friendships, people who, when they see good in me, they thank God. When they see the bad in me, you know, they sort of rebuke the devil or something. But what they don't do is they never question my sense of being. So he was sort of getting rid of the idea that, well, if this guy's behaving in a certain way, we can question their existence. They never question my existence. They actually give me a sense of my existence. So what Augustine had was a tie to the soul. It had a tie to God, obviously, with the soul. But then he had a third component with memory and consciousness, which the Enlightenment philosophers go with. But his fourth component was this relational ontology, that I'm tied to these people, and that's what matters, and that's kind of what makes me who I am. I remember who I am the next morning because my wife affirms who I am, right? My children affirm who I am. And that relational ontology was clear in Augustine and went all the way up until around John Locke. And this philosopher basically said, nope, it's just memory, it's just consciousness. He sort of removed the relational component as a necessity and removed he didn't remove God from the equation, but he made it a necessary hypothesis, I guess, but not a personal sense of being. And then eventually you've got other philosophers that just say, hey, if this God thing is just a hypothesis, we can remove him together and just leave it as the inward turn, the self, the rational self, the shift from the sort of substantialist view of the soul to, no, it's just the rational self, it's just consciousness. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. The one thing that I had as I'm listening to this, which was quite fascinating with Augustine, I wondered whether the role of imagination, the imagined other, and its impact on our sense of self, rather, because we're not always around those others. So the other is present imaginatively, right?
Yeah, I think the theologians would call it the absent presence of the self, right? That the person can be gone, but you can still have a sense of their presence through the imagination. And he was big on the imagination. He called the mind like a storehouse of the imagination. And it's a great field or spacious place, counts images. And it was the recollection of all these events and how they tied his whole narrative self together. That's why his work in Confessions is so brilliant, because it really is one of the first, maybe the first autobiographical account where he could tie his past experiences, right, his present reality, and his hopeful future together. And that's Erik Erikson who gives that kind of framework to identity, that identity really is past experiences, present circumstances, hopeful future. And when those can't connect, you have, and that's what he coined, the identity crisis. You have an identity crisis where you don't know how your past experiences fit with your present reality, and you have no more hope for a future because everything kind of fragments. And so all this, could be tied back to those ideas of a narrative self where you can put everything together. And it is somewhat imagined, right? Because our stories may not be the same. And this is where that postmodern sort of shift, where we get rid of the meta narrative and we say every sort of individual narrative has its own validity. But in some ways, the pendulum was swung so far that it became such a radical inward turn that you have almost like, I would say, a radical individualism. Now, individuality, not the same as individualism. The individual is important. The individualism is more like an attitude where it is my truth, my existence, my happiness, and everything gets defined inwardly, and socially, it doesn't really matter. And I think we're coming to the end of that thinking, because we are realizing that others do matter. Society does matter. You can try to constitute the self inwardly and self-existent, and you could say that consciousness is primary and that's all that really matters. But try to go out into a society where you have to function and let people know that, and you'll learn really quickly that what other people think actually does matter to you. And so this is where I think we're seeing major shifts again, where we're going back to understanding the need for otherness, others to affirm my sense of being, my sort of inward experience. And when you don't find that, it's difficult. And so the negative side of that would be we end up with a new form of tribalism, right? We have our own tribe that agrees with us. And I think we're seeing that playing out in society all the time. But I think ultimately the goal should be that otherness is seen as a gift, not a threat. You know, I think of John Paul Sartre, where otherness is like his, I think he describes it as his hell.
Yeah.
So
it's a hell, yeah.
The hell, what are you gonna do all day? Just sit in your room? You have to see otherness.
He suffered from narcissistic personality disorder, so you know.
You just diagnose everybody.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, but there was another shift that came. So the Enlightenment philosophers, they made it a radical inward turn. Consciousness is all there is. But I think we can credit another shift to the psychology movement, the movement of psychologists, where William James and Freud, Erik Erikson kind of outlines in one of his books, I believe it was Identity Crisis, but they basically came to the conclusion that the self is something that can be described, but there's not sufficient words to do it. It's almost this intuitive thing that's discovered. And they use terms very much like the British Romantics, where it's almost like this discovery or this revelation. And so they use sort of divine words to describe it. But I wrote down a quote from William James, and this comes out of Erikson's book. But he says, a man's character is discernible in the mental or moral attitude in which, when it came upon him, he felt himself most deeply and intensely active and alive. At such moments, there's a voice inside which speaks and says, this is the real me. And it's like this thing that authenticates himself. It authenticates his deepest passions, his desires, kind of what he's been doing with his life, where he's going. And so the psychologist kind of brought in this idea of a teleology, like an end, like there's something greater, but we don't know what it is. But this idea of a movement to move beyond ourselves, to transcend, has come back into the discussion. Whereas, you know, in the 17th and 18th century, it was almost like, nope, there's nothing, we're just material beings, that's all there is. But it was this sort of intuitive movement from William James, and then again by Freud. I know Freud's name is mud in psychology, but he had some good ideas. Not many, but some. But Freud did the same thing. He basically said that his Jewishness even gave him a sense of identity, but it wasn't the religious sense of Jewishness. It was almost a collective imagination of the suffering of the Jews. It was a collective imagination of even his work with psychology and other psychologists. And he gives this speech to a group of psychologists, and he basically says that the influences on his identity of Jewishness and being a psychologist, that they couldn't be expressed in words, that there was almost this clear consciousness of inner identity that was a mental construction, but he also tied it to what he called his brothers, which were people who worked in the same field as him. And so he basically suggests that the core of the individual, the core of identity, is both inward and outward, right? And I think that's a big shift, because it went from inward and outward friendships, relational, to being purely inward. And then psychology went inward and then tied together the outward. But I think after Freud, there was more of a shift back. So there's almost this ebb and flow between, is identity fixed or is it static? Is identity created inwardly or is it outwardly? And where do relationships come into play? Is that kind of tie it all together?
So, you know, as a philosopher, when I hear this, it sounds like we haven't progressed too far from Parmenides and Heraclitus. We're still trying to resolve whether reality is fixed or whether it's constantly changing. But there seems to be a recognition that the answer to is it fixed or changing is yes.
Yes.
Yes, yeah, it is. And so it is, but and then what is fixed, what is changing, we could debate, right? Or is that all illusion anyway, you know, and that there is no self, right? So it's a very interesting idea.
But it ties to the idea, particularly in relationship to REBT, with the idea of the unconditional acceptance of self. it's an important factor, maybe one of the most important factors, because people they have this inward battle of, shooting on themselves, or, I ought not have, or whatnot. So it's a big factor, because you could put yourself into quite a negative space doing that. But I think one of the missing components, and maybe it isn't missing, maybe Ellis himself talked about this, but the relational aspect is a pretty big deal. You can totally unconditionally accept yourself and still hate the other.
Right.
And if that other is a really important relationship, and I don't want to make broad generalizations about psychology, but I know one of the big movements was the idea of boundaries, right? Like unconditional self-acceptance, and then create the boundary between the people who are, harmful or creating, discord or discomfort. But what about when those relationships are really important? It could still create a lot of discomfort for an individual if there's really close relationships and all we focus on is the self. There has to be some component that ties it to otherness. And I think you and I had talked about this at one point, probably several points, that unconditional acceptance of otherness is also an important factor.
Yeah, absolutely. And the bias in psychology, I think, has been that unconditional self-acceptance has primacy, but that it is also helpful to have, for a good mental health, to have unconditional acceptance of other. But if both are necessary, I don't care about the timing of it, because it doesn't matter which one's has primacy or what, because both are necessary. And in many ways, some people say, like in REBT, when we talk about unconditional self-acceptance, perhaps it's not important to know what the nature of that self is that we're accepting. It is the consequences of unconditionally accepting whatever that is, and unconditionally accepting whatever is the ontology of the other, and that tends to be what we focus on, right? And all kinds of research that the outcomes of unconditionally accepting yourself, not liking everything about that self, but unconditionally accepting yourself, is quite good.
Yeah, and for some reason in my own field, looking at theology, sometimes religious people can be the worst at this, which is ironic, right? Like there's a belief in a God that accepts you and loves you, but we can't seem to get that into our thick heads. And we continually create God, or I would say almost an idol. We imagine God to be a certain way and then project that onto him, that he's, ready to smite us or crush us. I mean, all the idioms that exist, right? Like, I don't want to go into church, I'll get struck by lightning, or God wants to like burn me with a magnifying glass like I'm a small ant. And we have all these images of God. And I would say, I don't know if those are images of God or those are just self-perceptions that are projected onto God. And that if we could really get to the point of saying, listen, there is a loving God that does accept you even despite you in your actions, then we might be able to create some sense of inner healing of you're okay, in a sense that you don't have to like everything about you. You don't have to just accept like, I'm this horrible, terrible person. But even if you were, it doesn't change the fact that he doesn't need you to be something. He's still God. But religious people oftentimes are some of the worst. And I think Ellis talked about this a lot. I think he's misquoted as being anti-religious. I can't remember which book I was reading on Ellis, but he had basically talked about the problem isn't religion. The problem is an over-dogmatized religion, where you start projecting these images onto God that really aren't even there. And then you live as though these things are true, which is the very basis of idolatry, right? To imagine God a particular way and then live as though that's true. So I think, there has been some major shifts from, the soul to the consciousness to the intuitive. And nowadays, it seems like all these things are getting tied together. People don't use the archaic word soul. They'll use word like transcendence or primordial self. It's a little more fancy, I guess, but essentially they're talking about the same thing, right? This eternity, this thing that goes beyond the body or the current moment.
But one more thing on that, and then I'd like to push us to some cross-cultural experiences and how that impact the sense of self. But it was really interesting. I mean, you took a swipe at Jean-Paul Sartre, and a deserved swipe. But I like one thing that he wrote in The Transcendence of the Ego, where he, without mentioning the name, is going for the jugular of Husserl, right? Father of phenomenology. And he says that the self never appears until when we're having the experience, right? There's no sense of self when we're having the experience. It's only when we're asked, when we have to recount the experience. Like if I'm looking at a tree, no self pops up in that experience. And if it did, then I'd probably go on an antipsychotic medication, right? But if you asked me, you know, after that, what were you doing at such and such time? I would say, I was looking at the tree, right? And so he says, it's just a transcendent self. It only pops up in reflection. It was there, lurking like the Wizard of Oz, right? Behind experience.
And that's where I think the whole idea of otherness being such a threat to my existence doesn't really fit with his model, because how do you even know that it is a tree, right? You had to learn it. You had to experience it through relationship. I mean, I have kids, and I mean, our conversations around the dinner table are constantly almost like metaphor after metaphor of explaining what things are, what reality is, how to even name something. But it's all happening relationally. There's no self sort of contained in a vacuum. And I think that's one of the biggest dangers of those lines of philosophy, is that you end up with this sense of nihilism. And by the way, I think Nietzsche is totally misread, and everybody says he's a nihilist. Nietzsche had a really interesting thought experiment, and even with the killing of God, he was sort of challenging people. Like, if you want to say God is dead, like, think about what you're saying. And then he had this thought experiment where he asked people, imagine that every day that you live will be lived for all eternity. Is that a nightmare to you? Is that something that gives you a sense of dread or a sense of eager anticipation? So his sense was, listen, whether or not God is alive, it doesn't matter. You still should be living as though life really does matter. And so I think a lot of these guys were just struggling with the reality of some pretty corrupt ideas that were attached to God and religion, institutional religion, trying to free man from these things. But then when they're left with themselves, that's scary if it's just you. So I think that's why the communal aspect has come back in, the relational ontology has come back in, where we see our consciousness as being bigger than just the individual. And I don't know how psychology is dealing with that, but I think it's important that we address that, because we can't just tell people, hey, you don't really need any of these people, you know, create all these boundaries. All that really matters is yourself. And I don't think any psychologist says it that radically, I hope. But if that's the case, that can be terrifying to a person, because they know those relationships matter. They're the ones they're still thinking about at night. You know, they're wondering, how did this relationship break? Or what are my parents doing? And they can create all the boundaries they want, but they can't get rid of the idea that these things have shaped them into who they are.
Yeah, and even Murray Bowen, the father of family therapy, right? Who really said that we need to differentiate from others, said something rather fascinating, that if you have a problem with another, it's better to work it out now, because it's very hard to make peace with a ghost. And so he was very much about working out those relationships. Maybe went too far in differentiation, and the feminist reminded him that we can be interconnected. It's not all about differentiating from the other. So I want to move to, because I know in your dissertation you brought up some examples of this. What about individuals who are, you know, born, raised in a particular culture? And again, we could debate what that is, or subculture, whatever. And then they come to live in a different place. And so the other is, and their habits and etc. are quite different. And as if, I don't know that anybody ever gives up on that other culture, right? And social media has made it very helpful to continue connection with the other while you're in a different community. What what does that do for a sense of self? Do people just flip, or do they come up with an amalgamation? How do you describe that?
Yeah, I would say there's a hybridity, right? Um, and I'm not sure that social media and the ability to communicate across borders is really helpful to people's mental well-being. I think it could actually cause more problems, because it used to be the sense that when you traveled, right, you left and you were sort of cutting ties. You had a clean sort of like, I'm traveling to the new world and you probably won't ever hear from me again except by letter once every 6 months or something. And you kind of had to recreate yourself. And you did draw upon those memories, and those memories are unreliable. Sometimes you even re-narrate those things to give yourself a stronger sense of being. But with social media, they're constantly connecting across international boundaries, right? Constantly. I mean, I've had dinner with people, dinner with this one guy, where the whole time he had his AirPods in, we're talking, and then suddenly he would talk in a different language. I knew he wasn't talking because I didn't speak the language, but he was connected to his family back home who was having like breakfast, and he's having dinner with me, but he's also participating in this whole other world at the same time. And so it's like they have their feet in two different spaces. A lot of people will really struggle to feel that they belong in either space. They don't feel fully American. They're having a hard time. Assimilation theory in America is pretty prevalent, pretty strong. There's not a lot of openness to integration, you know, and they don't feel fully American, but they also feel like they've lost some connection back home, because there's a constant reminder that you're not with us, and there's constant changing happening there. And I'm not sure that they can change alongside of those close relationships back home. So that it creates this really difficult thing to bring together. And I've seen some really significant issues, and I'm not a mental health counselor, so I wouldn't diagnose anybody, but I've seen some things that are concerning, because there is a sense of radical individualism here, but they know they can't do that because they have to send money back home. They have to constantly care for family members. They'll post things on social media that give them a sense that my family back home will see that, you know, I'm still, if they're Muslim, for instance, I worked with some Muslim groups, that I'm participating in all the religious ideas here. And then they'll post things about how well they're doing because they don't want to worry anybody. So they'll be posting pictures of cars that they don't even own, like taking selfies with, hey, I got another car. And really they're struggling financially. And so there's this fragmentation of like, wait, that's not the real you. It's an idealized version of you, and probably one of the highest idealized versions of you. But their family members back home, they see that and they're like, hey, send us money. Obviously you're doing well. And they don't have any money, and they're struggling to just pay rent. And so there's this fragmentation of who they're asking the question, who am I? But really they're probably asking a more practical question, like, what am I supposed to do? You know, and I think that's what Eric Erickson talks about with identity crisis. Identity isn't a question of like, who am I, but what am I to do? How do I function and live in a society where I have to be somebody else? I'm becoming somebody else. My family wants me to remain the same, and they're fighting this constant tension. And I think it's a really important thing to take into consideration in cross-cultural counseling. We can't assume, right, that our Western models are going to work on people that were not raised here. And we have to be careful that we take into consideration that they can't easily just break off that collective sense of identity. That collective identity is powerful.
And that's coming up in the research on how to treat individuals who even aren't crossing cultures. Wonderful piece of research that came out of looking at how to treat individuals in Afghanistan who were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And the DSM-5, you know, our Bible of mental health disorders, wasn't particularly helpful because it defines symptoms pretty much tied to individuals. And when an individual had experienced PTSD, I mean, there all kinds of tragedy over there and trauma, they usually talked about its impact on the community and family. You know, that's not how we go about doing a diagnosis here. I mean, we will look at that, but not to the degree the good thing is that the DSM-5 is asking us to slow down the diagnosis and pay much more attention to culture. But what do we pay attention to is a difficult issue, right? And et cetera. So, it's interesting. The other thing, Trevor, that you talked about, it was this discrepancy between the self as portrayed and the self as felt, or even if that's fragmented, the self as felt, even, or the focus maybe on the symptoms of the anxiety or sense of failure or whatever. But Carl Rogers, God bless him, talked about the discrepancy between the ideal self and the real self, the felt self, and the greater the discrepancy, the greater the symptomatology. And it sounds like that's your experience.
Well, and this is where I think there's a need for research with how people are representing themselves in social media platforms. I was joking about this with my daughter. She's 14, she wants Instagram. And we were riding in the car yesterday, and we have a golden retriever that we take on runs. So, get everybody out of the house. Let's all go for a jog or a walk, whatever you want to do. But we're going to go to the river. And the golden retriever just kind of like sat down on her lap. And she was like, "Get off of me. You stink. I'm not even sure I like you." She just doesn't like the golden retriever. But then all of a sudden I see her like hugging my dog, Loki, the golden retriever, and taking a selfie. And I was like, this is why I don't want you to have Instagram, because that post would go up and say, "Out with a run with my boy, my best friend, my dog." But in reality, you're like, "This dog stinks, get off of me." So you end up projecting something into this, imagined space, which is very far from reality a lot of the time. And I think you're right. I think Rogers is right when he says that the greater discrepancy, the greater potential there is for serious mental health issues. And that's what I've seen in all of my research, is that their felt or their perceived idea of their self and their projected idealized self, they can be so far from reality that I'm concerned. I get concerned for those folks, because how do you, if you come from a collective culture where you really do need that validation of the community, of the group, of those close relationships, which are much broader in a lot of other places in the United States. If you need that affirmation and you're projecting a sense that this is what they'll affirm, this is what they'll like, and it's so far from reality, you're gonna have some serious issues accepting yourself, because you're not even sure who it is anymore.
Yeah, and I think there's some research that did look at young women, often on Facebook and other social media, that they projected this ideal self and they were still attacked. And so if they're projecting the ideal self and that's attacked, then who am I? How do I ever measure up,
Yep. And that's one of the reasons I think focusing on that acceptance of others is important, because if you can accept the others, listen, people back home, they're probably not going to accept some of those changes, and helping them to process through that. What does that mean when your ideas change? It's almost like the kid, right? It's almost like a form of adolescence when your kid starts to have ideas that are different from your own. That can either be a real threat to a parent, or it can be a gift where they're like, okay, I'm glad that my kid's starting to think outside of the box. And obviously you want them to remain somewhat close to the box, but what you don't want to do is say, here's the boundary line, and when you begin to think beyond this line, you're done, you're gone. That's a horrid horrid parent, because they're afraid, but at the same time, what they end up doing then is just casting them out and saying, figure it out on your own. Well, they will eventually find a community that agrees with them. The internet's full of them. So is that what you want? Do you really want that to happen? Or do you want to walk alongside of someone and say, let me help you to figure these things out, even though we may not agree? I'm not going to question. It's back to Augustine. Even though we may not agree, I wouldn't question your existence. Our relationship is much stronger than ideas. Our relationship is much stronger than, I would say, than anything. That there's nothing that can break that there is a sense of closeness that transcends language. It's like there is something intuitive about it that we need to hold on to.
Yeah, and I think you hit on it. I'm much more interested and more lately in this idea of threat versus opportunity. And Jean-Paul Sartre just went wacko when he saw experience the other as mere threat without opportunity. And I've seen this, and it's scary with COVID, that more and more we experience the other as threat, which, you know, really broke down community, or created some really aberrant forms of communities based on some aberrant views of health and all kinds of things, you know. So and so I don't know that we have helped individuals in the culture navigate what are healthy ways to respond to threat and to find opportunity in that. And one of the ways, I think, is not through the dissolution of the transcendentals or the transcendent, those things that we strive for that give unity and meaning to our lives. We start breaking those down, then we've got some problems.
So, and I think that's what I was trying to get at with the whole idea of the Enlightenment philosophers that sort of made God a necessary hypothesis and then eventually just gone. If there's a teleology, if there's something transcending our current state, that can give us a sense of hope. And even if we have different views of what that is, there can be sort of a common sense that there's something more than just myself. But when we turn it inward to a radical position of inwardness, and I think COVID, like you said, has demonstrated this, we've just spent a year and a half in self-preservation mode. I mean, if you ever wanted to see what society would look like in self-preservation mode, just look around. We look at everyone as a potential threat to our well-being. We've spent a year and a half sort of, you know, pulling in the wagons, to use a metaphor, right? And just, it's only me and my nuclear family, and that's it, and everybody else is potentially a threat to my well-being. I think we're going to see the repercussions of that for years to come in mental health. I do. I think it's going to have a radical effect on people's well-being. That relational component is so important, and people have lost it. And I'm not sure that it can be gained through electronic space like Zoom calls. I really don't know that it's sufficient.
And similarly, have we in some way gone too far to see tying being alone with loneliness and having that as a threat, that we cannot be alone, and that's intolerable, so then we take major risks to be connected in unhealthy ways. And on the other hand, too far if we experience the other as threat only.
Yeah, and I know there's two philosophers that you and I have talked about in the past, Buber and Levinas. They did a wonderful job kind of bringing in the idea that the other is not a threat, that it really is part of our existence, the I-thou relationship, and seeing others as persons first, not just looking at them as either threat or opportunity, but really persons. And I think that's a really helpful model for society, is to acknowledge when you have a client that comes in, that if they have a strong sense of collectivity, a strong sense of their family, a strong sense of maybe their religion or their religious community, to really encourage that and say, okay, that's important, that's meaningful, it matters to you. So I'm going to help you navigate what that looks like. Because the last thing I would want to do is take a Muslim immigrant who's struggling with their sense of Muslim identity. I would use the word identification, Muslim identification. And I wouldn't want to just tell them, hey, listen, if you're kind of done with all that, just drop it, just leave it. Like, no, it really does matter to them, because it's their family, it's their community, it's their grandparents, it's their great grandparents. I've met some immigrants that can name 7, 8 generations back. I mean, most Americans can do their grandparents, and that's about it. Maybe not even first and last name, because there is such an emphasis on the individual. And I think that can have serious consequences. There is something good about the idea of collective consciousness, about collective morality, about collective sense of self and being. And we just have to be careful that we're not transplanting our Western individualist attitudes to non-individualistic societies.
Yeah. Well, Trevor, we just have a few more minutes, but I just want to ask you, where next for you? What's the, you finished that dissertation, so now you've had a chance to breathe. Um, where do you see your research going next?
You know, most of my studies is in Muslim-Christian relations, but the last 3 or 4 years, I've seen a radical shift with particularly evangelical Christians that's so concerning to me that I'm thinking about writing something specifically on questioning whether or not the personalization of God, you know, you hear people saying like, it's about my personal relationship with God. And that's a pretty common framework, personal conversion, personal relationship,
Yeah.
personal Bible reading, personal. And I almost want to, I'm thinking about, and I've started to write it, questioning whether or not that's actually a helpful shift to personalize God to the point of which I can just say something like, you know, God told me so, and that's that. And all of a sudden there's no communal sort of aspect of it. And so you end up with a very dangerous, I think, model where everybody just does what's right in their own eyes. And then when you can give it a religious meaning by saying, oh yeah, and by the way, God told me, that scares me. So I'd like to write something about how we got to the place we are with identity, but then specifically how those frameworks of identity have sort of been sanctified, right? You sanctify that identity, and that to me is even more scary because, as Blaise Pascal said, you know, people are willing to do horrible, violent things to people, but if you give them religious motivation, they'll do it all the more and with much more joy because they have a religious motivation. So, in sense, working with both Muslims and Christians, my hope is to bring some, maybe bring some balance to see that, you know, we're not as opposite as we're often portrayed. There's a lot of propaganda out there that creates discord and disunity in order to achieve political ends. And I'm hoping that the people of faith can find that there's more to it, that people of faith can get along, they can work together, and they can see others as a blessing in their lives rather than a threat. So something along the terms of identity and religion and culture.
Well, I'll be curious to see that. I mean, in REBT, it comes up when we're trying to treat an individual who has often court ordered, so someone else perceives that they have a problem with anger, and and often, if they're from religious backgrounds, they will say, no, this is righteous indignation rather than anger. You know, I've got God on my side. And yet we don't want to say that righteous indignation is not a reality, right? But I don't know that the individual can alone make that declaration. You know, maybe it requires a community, but you get that figured out and you can tell me when it's rage and when it's righteous indignation, so I can know what to treat. I would covet that, you know, the ability to make that discernment, right?
Yeah, well, there's a wonderful book that was just recently published. I recommend it to some of your listeners. It's called Reading While Black, written by Esau Macaulay, who's an Anglican priest. And he talks about that there is righteous indignation. And he's talking specifically about slavery and the religious motivation behind a lot of the slaveholders. But what he cautions people to is be certain that you don't then act upon that righteous indignation and then also sanctify your actions as though somehow those are God ordained too. It's okay to be upset and to feel that you have a religious rationale for why you're upset, but you can't go and then act upon it and say, oh yeah, and by the way, that has religious rationale too.
That's an infinite regress if we do that. So that we can fend off possible judgment, right? So
yeah. I will say, I'll just close with this, Steve. One of the people that I've really enjoyed reading here recently is an Eastern Orthodox theologian named Zizulas, and he talks about relationships of ontological significance. And he bases this basically in the idea of the Trinity, right? That God is constituted relationally. And he really says that in the beginning, and you know, it is the rejection of the other par excellence, meaning God in the garden, that there is an inherent sort of fear built in to humanity of otherness. And then ultimately we have to figure out, like, what is it about otherness that scares us so much? And how do we get to that place of unconditional acceptance of the other as a gift, not a threat, not something to be conquered, not something to be crushed, not something to be stood on, but something to see as a real blessing, something that gives us a sense of our being. So tying it all together, I would just say that the self is tied inwardly, outwardly, relationally, socially. And when one of those things breaks down, I think you're going to find problems, whether that's relational breakdown or breakdown with the way in which I see myself and want to live. If I say, hey, I got to be my true self, but society is constantly seeing that as a threat, that can be really difficult for a person. So you want to be able to look at all those things together. You know, how is their understanding of self in society? How is their understanding of self with their family, close relationships? How is their understanding of self inwardly? If they're a spiritual person, how is it looked at in religion? All of those things matter. So I would just say, as best we can, we have to look at the whole person and the whole community that they're a part of.
Good deal. Well, thanks so much, Trevor, for taking time out of a busy schedule to talk about this. And if people want to get a hold of you, is that possible?
Yeah, I mean, it's just my name, Trevor Castor at Gmail. If people want to email me, they can. If they've got questions or they want any of these resources that I've kind of pulled from, I'd be happy to connect people with those. So feel free to put that. Just don't put it in online spaces. I don't want to get picked up by like a robot and then get emails like every day from random things. But like if they're real people and they want to email me, I'd be happy to respond.
Okay. Thanks so much, Trevor. And you have a good day, you and your family, and that nice golden retriever.
Thanks, Steve.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.